The North Atlantic in winter is not water, it is something older than cold. The waves move like molten lead beneath a sky the color of ash. Ice forms on the ropes before the sailors can tie them. The wind cuts through wool, through leather, through skin, until breathing feels like swallowing glass. And somewhere in this vastness, a wooden ship, no longer than a modern bus, cuts through the darkness, carrying 30 men who will not see land for 17 days. They are alive. That is the first impossibility. The year is 1002. The destination is a rumour called Vinland. The vessel is a Nar, a merchant ship built from oak planks so thin you can see sunlight between them when they flex. There is no cabin, no enclosed space, no engine room radiating warmth, just an open hull exposed to spray that freezes before it hits the deck. And yet these men do not die. They do not lose fingers to frostbite at the rate they should. They do not huddle together in the collective failure of hypothermia. They endure weeks in conditions that would kill a modern sailor in hours. The question is not why they traveled. The question is how they survived the crossing without burning their ship to stay warm. Because fire on a Viking ship is suicide. The wood is soaked in pine tar. The sails are coated in animal fat and beeswax. The ropes are hemp and wool, both eager to ignite. One spark in the wrong moment, and 30 men become a floating pyre in the middle of an ocean with no rescue. The sagas tell us they crossed. The archaeology confirms they arrived. But nowhere in the literature, nowhere in the artifacts, is there evidence of braziers, of fire pits, of the one solution that seems obvious. The Vikings heated their ships. They kept their crews functional. They did it without flame. And for 1,000 years, no one thought to ask how. Until a team of experimental archaeologists in Norway tried to freeze to death the old way. They built a replica longship using 9th century methods. Iron rivets, overlapping oak strakes, a single square sail. They waited for January. They sailed into the Barents Sea with no modern equipment, no synthetic fabrics, no emergency beacon. Just wool, leather, and whatever the Vikings knew that we had forgotten. The first night, the temperature dropped to -12 Celsius. The second night, the wind picked up. By the third day, ice had formed a shell around the oars. And the crew, 16 men and women, trained in historical survival, began to understand something that academic papers had missed. The Vikings did not fight the cold. They became part of the architecture that held it at bay. The first layer is metabolic, not poetic, not spiritual, cellular. A Viking sailor ate between 4,000 and 6,000 calories a day at sea. Smoked fish dense with fat, aged cheese that crumbled like chalk but carried the energy of summer grass, flatbread soaked in whale oil, butter so old it had fermented into something sharp and faintly alcoholic. This was not cuisine. This was fuel. The human body generates heat as a byproduct of digestion, especially from fat. The Vikings understood this, not through chemistry, but through survival. They ate like men stoking a furnace because their bodies were furnaces. Every meal was an act of thermogenesis. Every bite raised their core temperature half a degree, enough to blunt the wind, enough to sleep without shaking, enough to wake and do it again. But food only burns if the body can protect the heat it creates. The second layer is textile. And this is where the story becomes strange. Modern cold weather gear works through insulation, trapping dead air between synthetic fibers. Viking clothing worked through integration. They wore wool, but not the wool we know. Theirs came from a breed of sheep that no longer exists. A North Atlantic variant with fleece so dense it repelled water while still breathing. The fibers were spun loosely, then woven in a way that created thousands of tiny air pockets. The result was fabric that stayed warm even when wet. They layered it tunic, cloak, sometimes a third overlayer stitched with overlapping scales of leather. But the real innovation was in what they did not wear. No tight weaves, no waterproof shells, nothing that trapped sweat against the skin. Because sweat in the Arctic is a death sentence. Moisture is the enemy. Vapor is the vector. The Vikings dressed in a way that let their bodies breathe while their heat stayed close. It was not insulation, it was selective permeability, a skin within a skin, and then there was the ship itself. A Viking Nar is not a container, it is a membrane. The hull flexes with the waves. The planks, called strakes, overlap like scales, each one sealed with wool rope soaked in tar, then compressed until it becomes nearly waterproof. But nearly is the key. The ship breathes. It allows air to circulate beneath the deck through the gaps around the cargo. This prevents condensation. In a sealed space, human breath turns to frost on the walls, then melts, then soaks into fabric and wood. The Vikings avoided this by building ships that never became airtight. Cold air flowed through. Warm air rose and escaped, but the metabolic heat of 30 men radiated into the space between the strakes, warming the wood itself, which became a passive thermal mass. The ship absorbed their heat during the day and released it slowly through the night. It was not enough to make them comfortable, but it was enough to keep them alive. Still, none of this explains the hands. Human fingers lose circulation first. The body sacrifices the extremities to protect the core. Viking sailors spent hours gripping wet ropes, adjusting rigging, bailing ice water from the hull. Their hands should have failed. Frostbite should have claimed them one by one until the ship could no longer be sailed. But the evident skeletal remains from Viking-age sailors recovered in Iceland and Greenland shows something unexpected. No significant tissue loss, no amputations, fingers intact. So they must have had a method, and they did. It was discovered in a leather pouch found in a 10th century shipwreck off the coast of Norway. Inside were two stones, soapstone and flint, and between them, a residue, charcoal dust, mixed with animal fat and crushed birch bark. The Vikings carried heat without carrying fire. They made hand warmers. They would heat the soapstone near a shore fire before departure, wrap it in wool, and keep it inside their tunic. The stone held warmth for hours. When it cooled, they rubbed their hands with the fat and charcoal paste, which generated mild heat through friction and chemical reaction with moisture on the skin. It was not fire, it was catalyzed warmth, a low-level exothermic process that modern chemists recognize as oxidation. The Vikings did not have the vocabulary, but they had the practice, and in the margins of survival, practice is everything. Then there was the social technology. On a Viking ship, no one sleeps alone. They packed themselves into the hull like puzzle pieces, oriented so that each man's exhaled breath warmed the back of the man in front of him. They slept in shifts, but the shifts overlapped, so the space never fully cooled. The weakest sailors, usually the youngest or the sick, were placed in the center, surrounded by the largest men who generated the most heat. This was not kindness, it was systems thinking. A crew is only as strong as its coldest member. If one man freezes, his tasks fall to others, who then overwork and become vulnerable themselves. So the Vikings built heat distribution into their social structure. Sleeping arrangements were tactical. Body placement was engineering. They survived the cold collectively because they understood that warmth, like water, seeks equilibrium, and if you control the gradient, you control who lives. There is one more layer, the psychological one. Cold is not just physical, it is cognitive. Below a certain core temperature, decision-making fails, memory falters, a sailor forgets to tie a knot, a navigator misreads the stars. The ship drifts. In the sagas, there are passages about skalds, poets who traveled with the crew and recited epics during the worst storms. Modern researchers assume this was entertainment, but newer analysis suggests it was neurological maintenance. Reciting complex poetry requires the brain to stay active, to process rhythm and memory and language. It generates mental heat. It keeps the prefrontal cortex engaged when the body wants to shut down. The skalds were not luxuries. They were survival equipment. They kept the crew human when the cold tried to make them meat, and so the picture becomes complete. The Vikings did not heat their ships with a single technology. They heated them with a system: food as fuel, wool as architecture, stone as battery, social structure as thermodynamics, poetry as neuroprotection. Each element insufficient on its own, but together, woven into a culture that had no word for engineering but practiced it in every crossing. They created a form of survival so seamless that it looked like magic to those who did not understand it. They did not conquer the cold, they negotiated with it. They built a truce from fat and wool, and stones warmed by fires they left on shore. We know this now because we tried to die the way they lived. The Norwegian experimental crew returned after 9 days, They had frostbite on their faces. One crew member had mild hypothermia, but they returned. And in their journals, they wrote the same observation again and again. The cold was not the enemy. Ignorance of the system was the enemy. The Vikings survived because they had no single solution. They had a web of small technologies, each supporting the others, each vulnerable alone, but resilient in combination. It was not innovation, it was integration. And this is the lesson we are only now relearning. Today, we build redundancy into spacecraft, into hospitals, into supply chains, separate systems that back each other up when one fails. The Vikings did this in the 9th century, with wool and stone and social hierarchy. They understood that survival in extreme environments is never about one brilliant invention. It is about dozens of small, interconnected practices that work only when they work together. It is about building resilience into culture itself, so that knowledge becomes muscle memory, and muscle memory becomes instinct. The ship does not heat itself. The crew heats the ship. The system heats the crew. And the knowledge of how to maintain the system is the technology that matters most. We have warmer clothes now, better ships. We have fire that does not burn, and heat that does not smoke, but we have lost something too. The Vikings knew that the environment was not a problem to solve, but a partner to negotiate with. They knew that survival was social, not individual. They knew that the warmth you needed tomorrow was created by the choices you made today. What you ate, how you slept, who you placed at the center of the huddle. These were not superstition, they were sciences we are still trying to name. The North Atlantic is still cold, the wind still cuts, but the Vikings are no longer there. What remains are the ships they built, pulled from bogs and rivers, their wood still smelling of tar. What remains are the bones of sailors buried in frozen ground, their fingers intact. What remains is the question of how they did it. And now, finally, we have the beginning of an answer. They carried the fire in themselves.